So I am a tippling. So okay, I'm a tippling philosopher, and I am interviewing the author Aaron Adair this evening, who has written a fantastic book called, if you can see it there, "The Star of Bethlehem: A Skeptical View," with a beautiful cover. Aaron Adair, and forward by the astronomer Bob Berman. So, just going to talk about that book and what place it plays in the sort of skeptical movement, and the use of the book, and the object and the aims of the book with the author himself. So, Aaron, do you want to introduce yourself to people that might not know who you are?
Sure. I'm a physics grad student at Ohio State University, and I'll be a full PhD in just a couple of weeks, just having to do the last fun bits for getting that finalized. As I say, I've been working in the area of physics education in my grad studies, and I've previously studied and gotten degrees in astronomy and mathematics back at Michigan State. And this is a subject that I have been studying and publishing on now for several years. I first published on this back 6 years ago in Sky and Telescope, and last year a peer-reviewed journal article about interpretations of the Star of Bethlehem over the last 2,000 years. So that's my basics
So,
background, and of course, author of I say, good book.
well, the great thing is it's not just you and I who say it's a good book. It's actually, Richard Carrier's come out and said it's awesome in a personal piece of communication, but he's also written a fantastic review on his blog, as well as giving you an endorsement on the cover,
Mhm.
as well as other people like David Fitzgerald, Jason Colabito, and a few others. So it's been really well received. Before we get onto what it's about, so that must be heartwarming for you. So how do you feel about the recognition it's received so far?
I've been very happy with the fact that there have been many people that I respect that have been willing to read this manuscript and actually say that not only is it okay, but even some people willing to say it's now like the final or definitive word on the subject, which I'm hoping to aim for. That this is, effectively the end of the discussion, but I know it won't be.
And do you
And
know what?
hopefully,
That's what's so beautiful about, because it's not a long book. Uh, it's what, how many pages? About 146 pages or so of the writing. And I don't know about you, but these days when I'm so busy, and I have a reading list which is just behemoth, and time which is so valuable and so little, that I really really like books which are now um, concise and shorter, so that I can bosh them out and get that knowledge, and then use that. So how do you feel about that, for example?
well, fortunately, with this subject matter, since it's completely focused on just one part of one story of the life and times of Jesus, it allows me to be more concise. But in a
Mm.
way, I'm a bit lucky too, considering again, there's been literally centuries of literature about this, trying to explain it and trying to condense it down so that way you don't need to go through and read every single thing that's been written in German and English and Latin and Greek in this thing, because
Yeah.
too much has been said and too much of it has been not worth saying. So
Yeah.
there's plenty to just finally file it down to something to say, here's what the ideas are out there, here's why they don't work, and here's what ought to be believed, at least on current evidence.
So the idea is that the Star of Bethlehem only appeared in the Gospel of Matthew. There are only two Gospel accounts which account for the nativity of Jesus, and one of them was the Gospel of Matthew, and it has the Magi, these sort of wise men from the east, who followed the star from the east to Jerusalem, and then lost it, and then found it again and followed it from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. And of course, this isn't reported in Luke, but
Mhm.
uh, is in Matthew. And you're looking at both natural and supernatural explanations for this phenomenon, uh, and testing them out and seeing how it fits with the historical account, or allows you to critique Matthew's account. So do you want to just uh, lay out the most common uh, explanations for the star?
Sure. Well, historically, the most common is it's a miracle wrought by God. That's pretty much what I find in the commentaries on this from the 2nd century up until the beginning of the 19th century, and nobody was saying otherwise until then.
Okay, so
And
before you go on to the other explanations, you say that the most common is a supernatural. Do you
yes,
want to just maybe very quickly uh, bring up some of the points against a supernatural explanation?
well, the first thing is just from our background knowledge is that when we see claims of the supernatural, of the paranormal, the preternatural, whichever label you want to choose,
Mm.
more often than not, when we look into them, they turn out to not be caused by something that's actually outside the laws of physics. It might be caused by mistaken memory from the person, or it could be fraud, or it could just be the fact that this was originally fiction that people got confused about later. So anytime that we see a supernatural claim, we have to have that initial skepticism because we know pretty much every other time we've looked into stories like that, it doesn't turn out well for the person making the supernatural claim.
Sure, and I suppose at the end of the day, if you have these, if it is a supernatural phenomenon, the idea is that the wise men seem to be, or appear to be, the only people on Earth that saw this supernatural thing. And if it did go across the sky, okay, so it's not a star, it's not a comet, it's not a conjunction, it's just some kind of weird light, weird star thing that's hanging pretty low that God has just zapped into being, and these
Mm-hmm.
guys follow it. So the odd thing is that, well, why did no one else see it? Well, then you start getting onto ideas of, well, maybe only the Magi could see it.
Only the faithful will see this thing, yes.
Right. And then, of course, you just get onto completely unfalsifiable claims. I mean, if you accept that, you can just, just say anything. You can accept, God only does things which certain people see and certain people don't, go and disprove that. I mean, how do you feel about those kind of explanations, ad hoc rationalizations?
Well, it should at least give us pause because not only do you now need your supernatural claim to be true, but now you need a whole bunch of other ancillary additions to that to be true. So it has to logically make it less and less probable. And if you already have something implausible, and to make it so it's even logically coherent, you add more and more stuff to it. In the end, you lost.
Yeah, yeah,
Unless you
sure.
can actually show in the end that the things you attach to it have evidence besides themselves, not just I thunk of it, therefore it's true. All you
Especially when
have is a Rube Goldberg machine.
Yeah, yeah. Well, especially when you've got loads of other examples where in contemporary culture people have made up shit to go,
Yeah,
especially astrological and astronomical shit, to go along with their claims, birth claims, and this and that. And of course, this just fits into that context rather neatly.
yeah. I mean, how many people actually believe that a star actually guided Aeneas on his way to Italy, as was the Roman myth, or that the stars were astrologically just right for the birth of Krishna, as there is in some Indian legends? Somehow we look at that and we just go, eh. But in this case, oh, no, 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 no.
So the prior probability of this being true is very low. So in order to balance that prior probability being low, you would expect good evidence to support that. But what is the evidence of the Star of Bethlehem, natural or otherwise? The quality of the
Uh,
evidence.
as you alluded to earlier, the fact is that we only have one account for this thing. Every other account that we have is ultimately derivative from the one that we have in the Gospel of Matthew. And they usually have all sorts of other additions, such as the wise men or the magi when they were in Persia, that they were around and earthquakes were happening, statues were moving around, and all sorts of other, fantastic things were happening there. So the stories only get more and more implausible. But if we just go back to what we have originally, all we have is one account by one person who we actually don't know who wrote it. We don't know when they wrote it, but it was at least a century after the events. We don't know what sources the person had, how they chose those sources over others. They don't. It doesn't show any sort of ultimate criticism of sources. It just seems to say, "Here's the story, and I'm not going to even give you a reason why it's the least bit believable." And also, in the analysis that I do in the book, is that not only is it written in such a way that doesn't conform to history, in many ways it has the markers of what we expect from novels of that period. It's written like fiction.
Yeah. And so I suppose you get the situation when in the Enlightenment period you had a lot of critical um, biblical scholars who looked at the miracle claims and tried to explain them naturalistically. And although I think Johannes Kepler, who tried to explain the star, was pre-Enlightenment, if I'm
Hmm.
right in thinking that, there is obviously a rich history of the Enlightenment thinkers trying to naturalistically explain these kinds of phenomena. So, what are then some of these naturalistic explanations that you've tried to debunk?
Sure. One step, though, that I want to go back to with Kepler,
Yeah,
because he actually thought the Star of Bethlehem was a miraculous object.
right.
He, of course, also incorporated astrological interpretation into why the Magi were interested in the star, but ultimately it was something manifested by God in the air. You only start getting completely naturalized versions of the story circa 1800 or so. And then the most common things you're going to see, starting from around then and in current literature, is that there is the idea that it might have been a comet, which is basically what we call a dirty snowball. It's water ice, gas, dust, and when it gets close to the sun, it starts evaporating at the surface and produces these long, beautiful tails. Halley's Comet is the most famous of that, and come later this year, hopefully we'll be seeing a really good one called Comet Ison. So I'm
Mm.
hoping it's going to be the comet of the century. That'll be just awesome to see. That has been a proposed explanation for what was seen about 2,000 years ago. That then they try to make that then fit some of the details from the Gospel of Matthew.
I reckon
One that started.
you should. So I reckon you should pull a stunt, right? And you should, say, I'm Aaron Adair, this great whoever, and say, I'm gonna get onto the news. Say, I'm gonna follow this comet because I swear there's gonna be some Messiah being born, and then actually get a TV crew to follow you and say, right, we're gonna follow this comet, and then see how far you get. See where you get to.
Yeah, if I get lucky, the only person I know who I'd like to go and see that comet would lead me to would be to Mark Twain or Samuel Clemens, because he was born and died in the year that Comet Halley came. So
Right.
that's the only famous person I think I might
It
be
must
following a
be
comet for.
76, because is that a 76-year cycle? I seem
Approximately,
to
yeah.
seem to remember from history lessons.
Yeah.
But yeah. So some of the naturalistic explanations, whether they be stars, comets, or conjunctions,
Or
or
exploding stars.
exploding stars, hypernovas or supernovas, um, explain why these fall apart. Do very briefly.
All right. Starting with like supernovae or regular novae or hypernovae or insert prefix
So,
novae.
sorry, do you know what I put an S on the end, and with such high Latin pedigree as I'm sure I don't have, I should have said supernovae, not supernovas. That's really poor. Terribly sorry.
You'll find both in the literature. It's nobody's going to slap you around. There's not enough classicists amongst the astronomers. But the one major thing with all supernovae is that they're going to appear in the sky like a star, and they're not going to like move around relative to the other stars, and they're definitely not going to help you lead in some sort of direction. That the way that some Bible scholars have put it, Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan in one of their books, saying that basically it guided the Magi to their location like a GPS tracker. That it basically pointed them in the right direction and then hung over one particular hovel, saying, come here, eat at Joe's, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Um, a nova is going to be high up in the sky, or it's going to be off on the horizon. It's not going to point you in the right sort of direction continuously where you want to go, and it's not going to stop in some spot. Novae can't possibly fit that description. Comets are going to have the same sort of problem. They can at least move relative to the other stars in the sky, but they're also still going to effectively move from east to west or throughout the night, because that's the direction everything else moves. That won't fit the description of going from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, which is a southerly direction. Comets can't go south,
Mm.
unless somehow the Magi also, or God also then kicked the comet in that direction, which might have been an interesting thing to include into the
Yeah.
story. And then the other one that's might have the greatest amount of literature, the greatest amount of gravitas, is some sort of astrological interpretation of two planets coming close together or having the same line of longitude in the sky, which we call conjunctions, and that they're supposed to have some sort of astrological import. Not only is there the problem, of course, figuring out what things would have been interesting to astrologers at the time. What we actually have from the literature back then is they pretty much agreed on nothing.
Yeah.
That this astrological horoscope, this conjunction, you could find literature saying, oh, this is absolutely great. This will be the sign of King of Kings. Or I can look at the same horoscope and show that you're going to get a sex slave suffering from elephantiasis and seizures
Right.
from the
Right.
same horoscope. So you can't really win that way.
Do you know
And
what?
even so, it doesn't fit.
I went to a Tippling Philosophers get together last night. So every month we have a sort of philosophical ding dong. We talked about transhumanism and stuff last night, but one of the TPs came out as espousing astrology, and I just didn't know what to say. I was just like, oh shit, where do I start? Oh bollocks. So yeah, but obviously, back in and what you set out so well in the book is that back in those times, the Zoroastrians didn't really have, arguably a good sense of astrology, and also the signs that were about. It's difficult to argue what signified to Jews, for example, what signified particular things, and so even if you assume that astrology was around about and well understood, of course, the Persian people, how does a particular sign signify a Jewish Messiah? In a different kind of a different kind of social context to what they were living in, so on and so forth.
Right. And also, the simple fact is, why would Zoroastrians care about a Jewish Messiah? They already had
Yeah.
their own concept of a savior figure, and that person wasn't going to show up in Palestine. That person was going to show up in modern day Iran. Specifically, they believed that basically the sort of magic sperm of that person was sitting in one of the Iranian lakes that a virgin would go into and get impregnated by. So that's what they were expecting. They weren't
Nice.
looking
Yeah.
in Jewish texts and waiting for their savior or Jewish saviors. So first off, why do they even give two shakes of a stick about this? Let alone they don't have an astrological tradition. And when they started actually having astrology come into Persia during in later centuries, they had a visceral reaction against it, and they didn't think any planet was any good. They thought they were all corrupted by the equivalent of Satan in their religion of Ahriman. And so they thought every star that moved around was evil. So if they saw this guiding star, they would have freaked out. They wouldn't have said, "Ooh, the savior, follow." They would have said, "Holy crap, run away!" Monty Python
Yeah.
scene.
Well. You had the idea that comets were actually portents of doom and gloom, rather than being,
Mhm.
if you think that the explanation is a comet, that's highly unlikely, because actually contextually for that period, comets were seen as bad omens rather than good omens, right?
Right. Yeah, they're almost universally considered evil in just about every culture in the world. You have to really start digging around to find any exceptions. I remember the great astronomer Carl Sagan in a book that he wrote with his wife Andrian. They had found only like one particular tribe in Africa, the tribe, if I remember correctly, that actually saw comets as a good sign. So I mean, that's a lot of digging, and there's only maybe a couple examples from like classic literature where they try taking a comet and then somehow recontextualizing it so it was a
Yeah.
good sign.
Yeah.
It was favorable to say like Caesar Augustus because, well, you wanted it in his favor, and so they interpret it as like the soul of Caesar rising in the sky or things like that. So I mean, really forced interpretations to get past 99% of the other ones.
Yeah. So what you end up doing here is thoroughly debunking all the naturalistic explanations for the Star of Bethlehem. I mean, the comet doesn't make sense. Any kind of movement of the star, when you have the rotation of the Earth that's
Mm-hmm.
continual, and the sky is moving in particular, direction with regards to our movement, or the sky seeming to move, then it doesn't make any sense that these guys are following a star, down windy roads or across wherever to Jerusalem for a start, and then doing a dogleg down to Bethlehem. I mean, it's
Right.
obviously completely implausible. But how about the the star indicating a house? I mean, you do a little bit of Greek uh, analysis in the
Yes.
book. Uh, what can you tell us about the indication of a house?
All right. Well, I do go into like the Greek points, but there's actually a bit of analysis that I probably should have also included from the best scholar for this, John Cleese of Monty Python, from the great movie Life of Brian, showing that the wise men initially went to the wrong house and only realized that because the correct stable was literally glowing because of the star.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
if you show up to
genius.
a town and all you know is that the Messiah is here, all right, well, I got to find the right baby. Okay, this one. I mean, in some ways, you almost need, just from straight out logistics, the star pointing out. Otherwise, you're just going to find the first family who's a little bit, short on their luck and say, "Oh, yes, mine's the right baby. Yes, yes."
Mm. Of course,
Um,
Star gives you no information, does it? It tells you nothing. In fact, they don't know. If we put ourselves in the Magi's shoes, of course, they don't know
yes,
what they're going to find. The star is indicating. I mean, who knows? It's not. It doesn't tell you stuff. It just says
yeah,
it's just a sign. So
yeah. It's
they
just
why do they, they wouldn't be expecting to find a baby. They wouldn't be expecting to find anything. They could be going to find a magic gem in a piece of rock or something, and it just being, who knows. So
yeah.
it's odd that somehow, they can locate some stable or whatever with yeah,
Yeah, stable or guest house, or there's been a lot of
yeah,
translation things as well with that.
yeah,
But
cave as well.
yeah, yeah. But like I say, just on a point of logistics, you pretty much almost need something to like hover over your particular locale that you're looking for. But if you just want to stick, to the literal language that's given in Greek, it uses prepositions and forms of that basically are the sorts of things that we see elsewhere in the Gospel of Matthew and the Bible that say something is directly on top of or hovering right above. So, for example, the language construction there is using a form that you also find, for example, when Jesus is on the cross and there is a sign that is above him.
Mm.
Unless that cross is, scratching the surface of the moon, it's, maybe at most a couple of inches or centimeters above his head.
Yeah,
When it talks about when Jesus first entered into Jerusalem on a donkey that walked on the ground. In those cases, again, the same sort of preposition and form of grammar is applied there again and again and
sure.
again elsewhere in Gospel of Luke and the Book of Revelation and across classical literature. There's no point of confusion amongst those who know the language of what it means. And like I say, pretty much everyone who commented on this point was pretty much making the same points I have for the last, millennia or so. That what is described as something amazingly miraculous, and it only started being doubted when people thought, okay, miracles can't happen, therefore something else.
Yeah, so what you succeed in doing is debunking the account of the star from both a supernatural and naturalist point of view. Um, so the next question would be, why does this need to be done, and what is accomplished by debunking this as something that is claimed to have happened?
Okay. A little bit of historical background for me that I used to work as a planetarium show presenter.
Right.
I started doing that when I started college, actually. Uh, and in some ways, it also then helped me get into doing education work as well, since now I'm in physics education. And that's also where I first learned about these sorts of theories. They might have, I might have heard about them before from television, but consciously, I remember learning about it about 10 years ago as a planetarium worker. And these shows have been going on at planetariums pretty much around the world for a very long time, pretty much all the way back to the 1930s. And we're ultimately teaching people things that are demonstrably wrong that have been outside of the mainstream of Bible scholarship for almost 200 years, and pretty much trying to operate in ignorance of that and providing hypotheses that don't conform to the story, have all sorts of other maybe other historical or scientific issues. the show in particular I presented had to provide a theory that had to change the date of the death of King Herod. So it had to rewrite history to make the story historical.
Mm.
And this is a popular show that's been out there since at least the 80s. And um, the fact that we're pretty much, misinforming the public through a platform that is designed to be educational
Yeah, that's
is
terrible.
itself a problem.
So okay, so that's your grander kind of true knowledge is good, false knowledge is pants, right? So, but in a particular, which is a hugely important point, but in the particular case of the journey of the Magi, if you take out the star, what what happens to the account of the nativity?
Well, indeed, it's effectively, a linchpin bit of the narrative that we have otherwise no other explanation for then why Magi from Persia would have come there in the first place. So indeed, it just, the story just kind of falls apart at that point. But as I even demonstrate in the book, the very idea of Magi coming from Persia to there to declare a new king of the Jews would have effectively started a war between Rome and Persia, the two superpowers of the region, and at the very least would have had somebody else notice.
Yeah,
So, I mean,
yeah,
even
for
if the
sure.
star is removed, if somehow, I don't know, the Magi were just, really up on smoking some really weird Persian weed and just decided to make this sort of trip, they would have carried a sort of political baggage that would have had dire consequences for these two major countries, these two major powers of that area. So, I mean, even that won't make sense. So, indeed, criticizing the historicity of this story, even if somehow we accept the supernatural, if this is not a problem for us, that it causes so much to be doubted historically in the end because of just what we would have expected to happen from what background knowledge we have just from history, that
Yeah, yeah.
it falls apart. And then we have to doubt even more because if this is fiction, if this is made up, the rest might have to go as well.
Yeah, well, I think that raises two really interesting points. So my first point would be if you take out the star, then you don't have a way that the Magi come into the story, and you don't have a way that they get to Jerusalem and then lose a star and then find it again and dogleg to Bethlehem. And of course, it seems like Matthew is using the star to draw the Magi to Jerusalem to get Herod involved. So Herod finds out through the
Yes.
Magi. So Herod can then come and slaughter the innocents, which is a kind of replaying of the Moses, the firstborn dying, the last plague type thing
Hmm.
in the Old Testament. And then, of course, if Herod isn't being involved in the story because the Magi can't follow the star, then if Herod's not involved, then the firstborn don't, then the innocents, those children don't die around Bethlehem, and likewise, Jesus isn't chased out of Bethlehem to Egypt for a couple of years, which is what happens in
Hmm.
the Gospel of Matthew, and then comes out of Egypt, which is the fulfillment of another prophecy from the Old Testament. So it seems to me like if the star is proven to be false, right, then
Yeah, I think that book right there might help.
then then everything falls down like a set of dominoes, and literally Matthew's account of the nativity is just completely undone.
Yes. And yeah, so indeed, if effectively, yeah, once this bit of the history of the story falls apart, the whole nativity pretty much goes. And that's not really a great way to start your book with something that can be demonstrated to be so completely fictional or narratively impossible inside and out. That then when you get to chapter three, what are you really expecting now?
Yeah, and the
Especially when
idea
you get
is
to the last chapters of the whole guy. I mean, because eventually, the key point of the story is that the person who had the magic star also dies and rises from the dead. Now we have reasons to doubt this person can tell us what really happened.
well, I think that's the important thing. So if you are saying that we are, doubting the existence of the star of Bethlehem and therefore the Magi and all these other things, this is a falsifiable claim, and we falsified it straight off the bat. Then you can start looking at the rest of the Gospels and say, well, on what basis do we have an epistemic right to believe the claims these stories in the New Testament which are not falsifiable or verifiable in any kind of
Mhm.
way. So, the wedding of Cana, who was there? Who was at that wedding? What happened? What witnesses do we have? Well, we can't verify any of that, so therefore, it's just a mere
Or when
assertion.
Jesus is praying at the Mount of Olives, where he is alone.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So what epistemic methodology, epistemological methodology are you using to arrive at the conclusion that that's true? When you look at some of the other claims which are falsifiable and are found to be false. So, and these are the first books in, say, Matthew and Luke has the same sort of problems, where you
Mhm.
say, well, actually, the first couple of claims of Matthew and Luke are falsified. That we've looked at what might be able to verify it, and they failed, and they don't just not verify it; they actually falsify these claims. So, therefore, you know, what right do you have to believe these other claims? It just seems absurd.
Yes, and that was effectively what you've been saying is the conclusion of Bible scholarship circa 1850. It's hardly new except for, fundamentalists and others who are just unfamiliar or will not be familiar with biblical scholarship. So, I mean, since then, since pretty much the mid 19th century, it's now just been efforts of weeding out what little we can from the Gospels of what might be historical core, and that's been a major headache and has been pretty much going no place fast.
So I think it's great. I think a book like this, which is you've now provided the resource, which is you are the man on the star, basically, and I think you've really shown comprehensively that this part of the gospel narrative, certainly of Matthew, is false, and it's a case of unpicking these key things which make this whole house of cards fall to pieces, and of course that is hugely important. And then of course, when you talk about the planetarium shows and misinforming the public as well, you've got another dimension to the work that you've done in this fantastic and concise, excellent book, basically.
Yeah. Could you say some more nice things about my book?
For sure, I could wax lyrical. No,
Excellent.
but really, Aaron, I think you've done a really good job here, and I hope that you've place your marker down, and that you're now going to be the word on this topic, but also it'd be interesting to see where you might go next. I mean, do you have any thoughts on future projects or ideas that might take your fancy?
Yes, well, directly related to this, about a year from now, a little less than a year from now, I'll be actually at a conference at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, where they're actually having a big Star of Bethlehem conference in the 400th anniversary of the university and the 400th anniversary of Johannes Kepler writing related to the subject.
Awesome.
Um, so I'll be there with a whole bunch of other big experts in like ancient astrology and religions and New Testament
I love the fact that
studies.
you just said a bunch of other experts, because that's absolutely right. You are an expert on this, and you should be proud to be so. I mean, that's brilliant.
Yes, I was invited because of the previous things I'd written on there, because I'll pretty much be the expert on the history of interpretation of this star, while others, of course, there will have their massive expertise in, say, Persian religion or
Mm,
Roman religion or
mm.
New Testament studies. There also will be a couple people there who have previously written on the Star of Bethlehem as this conjunction or as this horoscope, and it will be
Some,
engaging in
someone,
those ideas as well.
someone like be interested to see Frank Tipler. I know someone that you've critiqued before.
Yes, he is at least currently not invited as far as I know. But the two people that are invited there that I remember, there is David Hughes from the United Kingdom,
Right.
and he, the thing that made him big in this is that he originally wrote about the subject that got published in Nature, not as like an article of like peer review, but like in their news and views section, because he had big connections there, and it's Nature.
Mm, mm.
And he also then wrote a book related to the subject a couple years later, which I consider probably still one of the best to go to for readability, for information on this. I mean, of course, inferior to my ever so glorious book,
Naturally, yes. Yes.
but still, I think very interesting, worth reading. And the other one, the theory that they're going to try to engage the most, comes from a retired astronomer, Michael Molnar, who
Mm,
has attempted, I would say, the best attempt to explain the Star of Bethlehem, to look at the original language and say how things work. Of course, I, in my book, show his flaws, including he doesn't know the Greek language for the life of him.
right, which is pretty important.
Yes, there are some people who make even worse arguments based on the Greek as well, but nonetheless, um, like I say, his was the best attempt, the most thorough attempt. So by me showing what problems that one has, then a fortiori shows how the rest also have to fall apart.
Yeah.
So apparently his thesis will be the one that will be like, I guess, the linchpin for the rest of the conference. But already, I guess you could say I've fired the first salvo.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Good stuff. Well, look, mate, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you, and I've certainly enjoyed reading it. And I actually edited this book just to let the viewers know. And there's loads to learn from it. It really is a comprehensive yet concise account of why we should be skeptical of the claims that have been made about the Star of Bethlehem. So I really appreciate you taking time to be interviewed on this.
Thank you.
No problem, and we'll look forward to seeing and hearing from you in the future.
All right,
Cheers,
and in
Aaron.
the meantime, you can make sure to purchase this. It looks great on the top of the Christmas tree as the real Star of Bethlehem.
Brilliant, love it. Okay, mate.